Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I'm John Atack. You know that, or you wouldn't be here, but I am John Atack, nonetheless. And almost every week, I talk with this lovely gentleman here, Christian Szurko. And because we're chums, and going back to what, 1987, I think
Something
it was.
like that, yes.
You strolled up with your rainbow shoelaces on. The Rainbow Shoelace Alliance. And so we've known each other a long time, and we talk because we are friends, and that's what we do. And I feel guilty, every week we sit and we talk, and I think, we really should be recording some of this every now and then. So that's what we're doing now. Now, when this will go out, who knows, because we're stacking things up at the moment. I have no idea. But this very day talked with Mark Laxer because I'm annoyed about traditionalism, this bizarre idea. And I've come at this, it's years and years of study have brought me to this point. It's not just I read a newspaper headline this morning or something. This has been building for a while. So the script runs something like this. Presently, many of the world's leaders are influenced by a guru, by somebody who is whispering in their ear and telling them all sorts of nonsense, which I called this Disney mysticism when we spoke the other week. And basically, so you've got Alavo, who is telling Bolsonaro what to do, but doesn't want to live in Brazil himself. He's not that committed to Brazil. We had Steve Bannon, who was the head of Donald Trump's campaign to be elected as president in 2016, and then became chief of staff at the White House, calls himself a traditionalist. And we have Alexander Dugin, who is a kind of at arm's length advisor to Vladimir Putin. Now, starting with him, Dugin founded the National Bolshevik Party, which seeks to take the best ideas of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Dugashvili, or Stalin, as he was also known, and bring together these ideas into a new political formulation. He gave Russian politics the notion of spreading discord, something they've been good at before, but he said, fund the extremes, get people fighting in the streets, get money into QAnon as quickly as you can, and pretend it's a conspiracy. And it was a conspiracy. And these are not the only ones. All around the world, Modi has his advisor in India. All around the world, there are these advisors. What they claim to be doing is taking us back in history to some golden age, make America great again, make Russia great again, make the Philippines great again. We'll go back to this illusory point in history where everybody was happy and everybody was free and everybody was having a great time until it was spoiled, usually by people of a different ethnicity. They are the spoilers. And so we're going to return to the pure culture, that Russia's going to have serfs again. America's going to bring back slavery. And we're going to go back to a golden age and all of these people are inspired by a set of childish religious beliefs. These are not theologians in any way, shape, or form. They've got a very simplistic idea of what that golden age was, and they seem to rely upon particularly such wiseacres as René Guénon, who gave us the perennial philosophy, which is Aldous Huxley gave us a book of that title, and people tend to think of that as the origin. It isn't. Before that book was published, which was in about 1945, Guénon, who was a Frenchman who'd converted to Islam, claimed to be a Sufi, had started writing this stuff about how we've got to get back to these spiritual traditions. We mustn't be materialistic anymore. What seems to be a commonplace, the perennial philosophy says, so there's an religion. There's an originating religion. All religions represent dilutions of this original religion. That's you are, as in the place in Sumeria. And so you can reach back through any religion and you'll get back to these fundamental and wonderful truths. And these people don't really bother to study the religions. They seem to get the kind of boy's own book of mysticism or something like that. And so they tend to believe in Kali Yuga. You know, they'll grab that from Hinduism and say, oh, there are these 4 ages, starts with gold, silver, bronze, then the putrid stuff left at the bottom of the bucket. And that's, this age is called Kali Yuga, the age of Kali, who's not very nice to people. And or they become end days Christians. They weave this all together and they have some idea the end of the world's about to happen. Let's see what we can do to help it. And Steve Bannon's even talked about blood and soil, which was Hitler's refrain. They follow Guinon and that kind of, well, you know, golden age happened sometime. We're bringing it back by visiting squalor and horror upon the poor, and we are going to be spiritual and not material. They also bring into this the ideas of Savitri Devi, the French woman who converted to Hinduism and invented Hitler Hinduism while Hitler was still alive. And she believed that he was going to end Kali Yuga. It's going to happen any minute. The awning on the cage of aquariums, as I've heard. And they are followers of Julius Evola. And Evola was an advisor to Mussolini. He wrote the racial purity laws that Italy introduced. He was a member of the Salo government, where after the collapse of Italy, Hitler tried to prop up a state within Italy, which he called Salo, with Mussolini and Julius Evola helping to run it. Evola survived World War II, is in Vienna at the end of the war because he'd given up on the Italians. And for another 30 years or so, spouted his fascistic doctrines. He is regarded as a hero by traditionalists. So that's I did this earlier today with Paul Mark. I'm ranting, and there's all of this material that has to come forward. So I'll say again what I said to him, which is that most of our traditions are actually recent. That tradition is an invention of modernity, that in fact societies are changing generation by generation. And so when we take back, you know, the mystical origins of say Hasidic Judaism, we get back into about the 17th century, around the time of the Amish and Mennonites, Anabaptist sects. That there's a point where they start and their tradition comes from there. But it's not, you know, thousands and thousands of years old. The Illuminati, the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, they're inventions of modern times, of recent centuries. The example I gave to Mark, and I apologize to anybody who's bothered to watch that and is now watching this or the other way around, was Santa Claus, the tradition of Santa Claus, which goes back to the beginning of time, or somewhere around the 4th century, where a bishop started giving stuff away, and possibly this is one of the origin stories, and he becomes the patron saint of thieves, Saint Nicholas. And why is it that people are so easily taken in? This is why. Because once a year he comes down your chimney and he gives you stuff. It's mainly stuff that was made in China that you don't want and you're going to have to throw away. But once a year, so he's got a really good rep. But the other 364, or in a leap year, 365 days, he's the patron saint of thieves. He's helping them come down your chimney and nick your stuff. So that's a tradition that we've got to be a bit careful of. Sometimes things are... But the cost
against recycling.
Yeah, that's it. Let's recycle.
It's recycling. He just invented recycling. That's all.
Yeah, give them the stuff from China back that nobody wants. Yes. So it can go into the oceans and poison dolphins at some point in the future. But this Santa Claus figure is pretty much an invention of the 1860s in the US. During the Civil War, you get the first drawings that will later become the Coca-Cola Santa of around 1930. Don't have the exact date, I'm sure Spike can find it. When the modern Santa Claus, the tradition Santa Claus. Christmas trees, which Prince Albert brought over when he married Queen Victoria. They're traditional now. All sorts of stories are incorporated into cultures within a generation, and will be then considered to be a tradition. So the traditionalists, I've laid out some groundwork for you there. Comment at will.
Is Will there?
Yeah, he's just off screen.
Okay, that's fair enough.
Somewhere.
So Will, my immediate comment is that what interests me, and it was highlighted in what you were just saying, is how some traditions get chosen to overlay other traditions. Because of course, if you go back into let's say the early church, there was an idea of Saint Nicholas, an entirely different kettle of fish. And to this day, that tradition still exists. If you go into some of the Slavic countries, you find that instead of Santa Claus, the equivalent there is a grandfather Frost rather than a Santa Claus. And it's got nothing to do with Saint Nicholas, because Saint Nicholas is still one of the saints within the Slavic churches, the Eastern Orthodox churches. So somehow what's happened here is that for commercial gains, dare we say, they've decided that, well, this tradition we can't make money out of, so we'll just push this to the side and we'll paper over the crack that's left with that tradition missing with a new tradition, which is commercial. It's viable. And so you can sell Santa Claus, and gosh, haven't they sold Santa Claus? So that's my first kind of thought about that there's selection going on, and sometimes it's the older traditions that suffer because they're not as dramatic, they're not as commercial, they're not as flashy, and we're entertained by flashiness.
Not as attractive.
Yes, and if things stay staid and quiet and solid, we tend to get bored with those. We don't tend to look at the floor and be entertained by it unless there's something crawling around on it or running around on it that we find fascinating. The floor is boring. We know floors. So we have to do something to replace the floor with something we find entertaining. When I was growing up, it was a train set. In America, it was Lionel trains, the O-gauge Lionel trains. Get that out there. And then a little bit later, it was these little cars that you could do up and race around. And that track with all that stuff on it was much more interesting. We had Lincoln logs. All you Americans out there who are of a certain age, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We had Lincoln logs. We had all sorts of building sets. Eventually, Lego crossed the ocean to us as well. Although I missed that. I don't know how I missed it, but I didn't know about Lego until much later.
I was only really breaking into the UK when I was a kid. So
I see. Okay, so I missed it.
Yeah, the Danes were keeping it to themselves.
So it's natural that the traditions are like the floors and walls and ceilings of our buildings. And what do we do with floors and walls and ceilings? We decorate them. And so, what you're saying makes perfect sense in a way. It's scratching that itch to be entertained, to be startled, to be amazed, to be something, to have some kind of step change in our emotional content. So that's oh, well, maybe that's a bit better like that. Just tilt that picture a bit more like that. And, we just don't want the plain wall.
Let's just reframe that picture.
Yes. Eventually we do that. And eventually we find a different picture we want, because I've had that picture up there forever. And I notice that doesn't happen in museums, though.
Yeah, now the new tradition will be, I was in South Africa in 1996, and my delightful host, Kim, we were driving, and she said it was a terrible shame that tribal peoples were losing their culture. And I hadn't thought about this. But here in England, as you have found since you came here, you have people who do what's called Morris dancing. And
it happens right outside my window some times of the year.
Deliberately. I send them there. And these guys, I'm sure Spike can find a picture, they dress up in white and green, and they have ritual dances with bells and no whistles, where they bang sticks together. And it's a charming and mildly amusing sight. But suddenly being put to me in, somewhere near Durban, that the people there are losing their traditions, it was sort of, what is tradition? Should I now go home and take up Morris dancing because we're losing our tradition? And then it made me think about the Lakota, who now perform, some of them perform the Sundance for tourists. And that was not really the original meaning. If we look back at Christianity, when Christianity first emerged, there were no churches.
Yeah.
There were basilicas, which stored the remains of significant people, bits of people. But churches, you'd meet at home. So the tradition of Christianity is on the Sabbath, you get together, you break bread, you drink a little wine, and you think about the transubstantiation of Jesus's flesh and blood and what this means in the world. And you talk to your friends about that. And you get into a bit of, is it agape that you do there? But it's one of those kinds of getting loved up with your mates. That's become this, how recognizable now would any of that be to modern Christians? That doesn't mean that their beliefs are wrong. It does mean that we need to be very careful about what we mean by tradition and whether it's necessarily even a good idea. Because there are traditions like foot binding, for example, for 1,000 years in China. I think that was a bad idea.
Oh, yeah.
I have seen X-rays. Treading on anybody's toes by saying that.
John, no. I have seen X-rays of long dead women whose feet were bound, and I just can't imagine how anybody did that, or what kind of fetish drove the desire for it. But that's just me. I don't understand crushing children's feet.
No,
or indeed any other part of children.
Yeah, female genital mutilation in our own, tens of societies still practice this despicable, sadistic torture of women.
Yeah, and just commenting on your thing about the churches meeting in houses, one of the things that has happened in the last 50, 60, well, let's say 50 years that I know of, is that some churches have indeed gone back to meeting in homes rather than doing big flashy stuff in buildings.
Yeah,
and they have tried to find their way back to that, but it was very much of its time, and some traditions don't translate well from century to century, so it has come with new problems, some of which are being overcome. Admittedly, not every home church is a problem, but there are some where they haven't worked out yet. How do we make this safe? How do we make it not so intense, not a hot house? How do we make this
not an authoritarian situation?
Yeah. How do we make this a comfortable place of worship rather than a very uncomfortable place of domination? That boundary can be difficult to find because that tradition grew up in a wider context, which helped to govern some of that. So traditions, I think we have to be really careful which traditions and why, and especially not traditions for their own sake. You mentioned before about the different leaders having a spiritual advisor, and I couldn't help going straight back to the book Lord of the Rings. Please remove the films from the world. That's just me. In the book, you have King Theoden being advised by Wormtongue, who is in fact working for somebody else, working for the other side. The name. He's working for the other side. And people might say that there's a certain resemblance between that and some of the people that Trump was taking advice from. I wouldn't possibly be able to comment on that, but there are some people who might point out, when you are that completely enthralled to an advisor who's outside your governing system, which is supposed to have checks and balances built into it. When you have somebody that you drag in from completely outside, you can't be sure that he's not, in fact, working for the other side, either at that time or at some later time.
And if we looked at Steve Bannon, then on the good side, Trump got rid of him.
Yeah.
He didn't last a year.
Yeah.
On the bad side, he was running Breitbart, a right-wing biased news organization. He was the vice president of Cambridge Analytica, which was not only, I mean, in their despicable use of, they reckon that they had Strategic Communications Limited, which was the holding company for Cambridge Analytica and for Aggregate IQ, which ran the Brexit campaign here. They claimed that they had 5,000 pieces of information on every adult in the United States, from basically buying huge amounts of data, particularly from Facebook. So you might think your privacy is protected by not going to Facebook or by not going online. The problem is, if anybody talks about you,
that's right.
Then that's why they had information on every adult.
Yeah. People tag photographs. You have no say over that. So if somebody took a photograph of any conference I've been at, and then they tag me in their own Facebook, it doesn't matter.
And even if you didn't sign a release form, as I didn't at the Manchester ICSA conference, because I was so appalled by the way that Naomi Gibbons was treated, and I'm going on the record with this again, that so when I was given a release form, I said, I'm absolutely not signing that. But I do notice that I am actually in the film of Seduced, even though I didn't sign a release form. So even if you don't want people, if you don't want people to think that you approved of something, as soon as the image goes public, then
it's too late.
It is.
And it's forever. It's on the internet. It's forever.
Yeah, it's in the Wayback Machine somewhere. Yeah.
I think the only solution really is for all of us to get Groucho Marx disguises whenever we go out into public.
Well, I think the problem is going to be solved because deep fakery is now at such a level that everything is made up. I'm not actually saying any of this.
No, and I'm not even sitting here.
Yeah, we don't really exist. We've just been virtually, there are now virtual personalities with millions, AI personalities with millions of followers, which is shows you how redundant human beings are. That after the what are they called, junk lords? These people who buy a Lamborghini and a new Lamborghini and drive it into a swimming pool.
Yeah,
they're just not getting the hits they used to, because now the robots are taking over, and they're so much more entertaining than half-wits ever could be. But so we're not real. So that's all we have to say, really. It's all been made up, and we would never have said these things.
Of course not.
But it leads us back into the demagoguery and the ideologues, these people who, even if their influence is brief, I mean, certainly Bannon was he was talking to people like Richard Spencer. It's white nationalist, not supremacists anymore, and very much involved in this tribalism. So with Dugan, you have the Eurasian strategy, this idea that these specific peoples and they should hang out together at their clubs and bars, but they shouldn't hang out with other people. Dugin seems to believe that anywhere that was part of the Russian Empire, tribally, is part of the Russian Empire. It'd be better for the people. He went to Georgia to stir that up in 2008.
Yep.
That's how it became pretty famous, I think. He's for grabbing back, Crimea. That was all good. Yeah. The Donbass and Luhansk regions, and anything else they can get their hands on. I think Belarus would also be going back, all based on this kind of golden age period where the Slavs were in one place and they were very happy, and the Germanii were in another place and they were very happy, and the Romanus were in another place and they were very happy. And I just look back and go, well, these tribal peoples were at war with each other.
Yeah.
And their kind of racial purity, there was a Viking grave uncovered a few years ago, and they found 2 Sami in full regalia, which meant the Vikings weren't racist at all, the Sami or Laplanders.
Yeah.
Were acceptable to them.
Absolutely.
A modern conception of racial differentiation probably started somewhere in the 18th century. It doesn't seem, the religion of whiteness, as the American sociologist, black sociologist, anthropologist Du Bois called it at the beginning of the 20th century. He talked about the religion of whiteness. And it does seem to come up, and so that now that neo-Nazis in America think that Hitler would have welcomed them, but if they say that they're of Ukrainian or Russian or Polish origin, they're Slavs, they're slaves. As far as Hitler was concerned, they're not Aryans, and they shouldn't be calling themselves that. They're bad people, all in all.
And you raise that whole issue of what is racial purity, this idea that when the Slavs lived all together, they were pure Slavs. And somehow, if they'd had DNA testing back then, they could have proved that they were 100% Slavs, and the Germans could have proved that they were 100%, and so on and so on and so on.
And the Nazis,
it just isn't so.
Just isn't so. And the Nazis actually tracing the history of people, that they decided they wanted to stop at the 18th century because there was so much intermarriage. Even the idea, I mean, in World War I, the famous Christmas truce where British troops played soccer with.
Soccer, yes.
They were actually playing, I believe, with the Saxon regiment. And at that point, the unification of Germany had only happened 40 years before. Right. So the Saxons didn't get on with the Prussians. And, those events caused such ructions. The British Army soldiers were forbidden from having cameras. It became a criminal offence to have a camera at the front, because you might send a picture back of the nice Saxon troops all having a nice little dance in the middle of the trenches or something like that. Getting people to fight again took weeks in that area. But the point I'm making is that Saxons at that time didn't consider themselves to be Germans. Their primary identity was because that would include the Prussians, and they didn't like them. And understanding that at the most extreme, what calls itself Germany today, and those, the boundaries are always moving as to which tribe you're in. Alsace-Lorraine is 1 week it's French, the next week it's German. And it gets very confusing. You can buy a bottle of wine that has a French name and then German written underneath it, because it's in an area where they speak French but are part of Germany. And these clear, simple, simplistic differentiations are actually about cultures that are changing and moving all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see it crystallized in Europe, in Switzerland. Do you mean French Switzerland, German Switzerland, Italian Switzerland? Which Switzerland do we mean here? And yet Switzerland is a whole nation state. It just happens to not really invest itself in this business of German versus Italian versus French. And somehow they make it more or less work.
Yeah, and their history is very interesting. They are fundamentally mercenaries who decide they're going to have a country. And it's not about racial purity. It's about not being beaten up by the forces around them, being separate from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from the French crown, and the pressures pushed upon them. And so what creates unity for them is not being part of the groups around. I would suggest that the same is true of the Jews in our time, that they are by no means a racially pure group. The history of Judaism is way more complicated than that. So they're not actually a group of people who lived in Judea and Israel, who were thrown out and who've gone back there, which is the idea. That's their golden age myth. And the reality is that I think the evidence is overwhelming. Shlomo Sand's book, The Invention of the Jewish People, he's a professor at Tel Aviv, lays out, mainly descendants of the Khazars in Eastern Europe, but Jews have been pushed into an identity by the outside world, by being ghettoized, by being separated out, by being forced into money lending as a profession long, long ago, before the Christian church decided it was okay to lend money, which I think came somewhere around the 15th century and caused horrors for the popes, because if there was one thing they liked doing, it was borrowing a lot of money, which they were really good at. So the Fugger family, who I think was Swiss, actually, now we come to mention it, were able to make a tremendous profit by the sale of indulgences. What a great idea! Sell somebody a pardon that you've now paid for all of your sins. You'll go to heaven. It'd be brilliant. You'll spend a shorter time in limbo because you've got one of these.
It sounds very like what some Republicans tried to do after January 6th, when they tried to get Trump to issue the earthly equivalent of such a pardon.
Yeah, well, it's a tradition, isn't it? So
there we are. We're back to tradition.
Oh no. So it annoys me, and you and I, we've spent a lot of time reading religious literature, one way and another. We've read quite a lot of it. I certainly don't feel very highly informed because there is so much to understand. But I'm guessing that I'm more highly informed than Steve Bannon or Alexander Dugin are. That they're, as I said, the boys' own book of mysticism. I don't want to be sexist. They can be a girls' own book of mysticism as well. That can be.
Don't you mean that little thing that you find in all the motorway service areas, the Idiot's Guide to?
Yeah, well, I was thinking about this earlier today, and I was thinking I could write the Dummy's Guide to Wisdom, because I think that may be the book they've been using. I don't think any of these people would last 10 minutes in an informed debate. It'd be like talking to Richard Dawkins about religion, because Richard Dawkins would say, well, it's all skyfarers and it's all nonsense, so I don't need to know anything about it. And that would be the end of the discussion. Whereas me, I find human belief the most fascinating of all things, the incredible things that people have believed.
We make our lives out of.
Exactly. We live inside our own construction of the world, our own interpretation and perception of the world, as I'm told Immanuel Kant said. And we will judge those around us according to our beliefs. For quite some time, I think I actually cited it in Blue Sky, so that's 30 years ago. Those who believe absurdities will commit atrocities, Voltaire. And as you know, because we talk every week pretty much, I am fascinated by the notion of belief. You've got a little chart behind you, which you keep there to show that we will do almost anything once we've been committed to a belief. So one of the worst things we see are the weaponized empaths, people who are really decent, kind, compassionate people who've been convinced of some barbarous nonsense that allows them to do hideous things to other people, believing that they are bringing a worldly paradise or something of the sort.
Clearing the planet, or saving America from the commie liberals,
making the world safe for democracy,
making America great again, reuniting the Slavic peoples of Russia. I know we talked about when I was in Moscow, and I had a close encounter of the unpleasant kind with some people who were part of a pan-Slavic movement within Russia. And at the time, the sensible people there were saying they'll blow over. They're of no consequence. We've moved past them. We've left them behind, and this is their last gasp. And
Whoops.
no, it wasn't. Not the last gasp at all. It was the beginning of what we're seeing now. And of course, for those people like myself who never really quite believed that, I remember kind of picking up the bits and pieces of what was happening with Putin very early on in his career, in his second career, and realizing this is a man who intends to change that. He doesn't want this to be left behind. This man is some kind of a cross between Stalin and the worst of the Tsars.
And it needs to be said that Pan-Slavism and Pan-Germanism, or Aryanism, rise up at the same time at the beginning of the 20th century, before the First World War. There are divisions within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it's been pointed out often enough, but regiments within their army would have people who couldn't talk to one another because they didn't speak the same language. So you'd have, Czech was being spoken, Romanian was being spoken, Magyar. These are very different languages. And there started to be a separation. And out of this came von Lanz and von Liszt, who would be the proponents of Aryan race theory based upon Madame Blavatsky.
Yeah.
That, there's also the idea of her Aryans came from Atlantis. There's also the idea of Aryans coming from the Arctic Circle, the people of the North Wind, the Hyperboreans, all sorts of things that stuck together in a kind of Aleister Crowley.
And am I right in thinking that it was around the same time, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that the theory of a civilization living in the hollow earth also began to rise?
Yeah,
at the same time, wasn't it?
Yeah, which Hitler is said to believe in. And you've got a whole raft of, I think with the dominance of the Christian church having been shaken in the 19th century, that people were allowed to be outspoken with their views. And you didn't just have free thinkers, people who were atheists, we use that term now, agnostics. There was a real flood of information into Christian society, European and American society, from the East. In the 18th century, Chinese work, James Legge begins to translate Chinese works, and people get, in the intelligentsia get very excited about some of these ideas, and then they get led along the garden path by Madame Blavatsky or Mary Baker Eddy or Ralph Waldo Trine and his In Tune with the Infinite. And these ideologues put forward ideas which become new traditions. Gurdjieff is another example of it.
Yeah.
They're taken on and believed as if the source they're talking about is true. So if you look at trying to understand Tibetan Buddhist ideas by reading Theosophy, you won't understand very much. That's because right. While Madame Blavatsky claimed to be channeling, was it 900-year-old 8-foot tall or 800-year-old 9-foot tall Tibetans? I always get that confused. That actually she was a nutcase and she was making it up. It wasn't like Alexandra David Neal, who'd actually gone to Tibet and studied for decades. This was somebody who was, got automatic writing or something and made stuff up. These things have become traditions. They only go back to the 19th century.
Yeah.
Much as with the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians, that in the 17th and 18th century, these groups come about and they say, we've been around for thousands of years. Mm-hmm. Leonardo da Vinci used to eat, drink chocolate with us. And we go back to the pyramids. We built the pyramids and we know all the secrets of everything.
Yeah.
And so a new tradition is born.
And the thing is, once you create a tradition, like that, where you have so much non-historical background, what you do is you create spaces for other people to fill in later. So what starts out as the Freemasons, let's call it innocent nonsense about, we go back to Solomon and the building of Solomon's temple. Well, that leaves a whole huge space that they can't possibly fill in.
Until Dan Brown comes along.
Exactly. Or, well, even before him, all the various other kinds of Illuminati.
Henry's, yeah.
The Illuminati mythology that he fed off of and
Henry Lincoln and
bastardized.
And the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail and all of the various absolute nonsense, which has been so thoroughly and completely debunked.
Because they created placeholders. It was like bookmarking a book. They just created these, hundreds of years where you could fill in, well, something must have happened there. We'll make something up. Of course, it isn't as simple as that, because something's going on psychologically where they double think it. So they create it and then they forget that they created it. It's like, straight out of 1984, they double think it. This is what happened. And maybe it was from some psychological aberration. Maybe it was because they worked out some kind of secret code. The number of secret numerological codes that have been created since before, was his name, E.W. Bullinger, who created his biblical numerological code. And of course, that's not the first one of its kind. You can go back into medieval Judaism and you can find the same kind of thing happening. You can find other people doing it. And numerology is as old as the hills. So
there's 7 hills.
Well, yes, and yes, let's not go there. Not tonight, anyway. But once you have space that you want to fill with a story and some kind of means of inventing any story you want and making it sound plausible, I guess you could say that approach with numerology was their version of deep faking. It was a kind of a verbal equivalent of deep faking. You take this sentence out of the Old Testament and you turn every letter into a number, and then you add the numbers up and you do some fancy arbitrary mathematics with it, and hey presto, that verse tells you that in such and such year BC, this event happened, and now you've got proof because you worked it out numerologically. And anybody can do that, and anybody pretty much has done that in the past, So you get people like Bullinger predicting the end of the world. You get other people predicting the end of the world. You get people going to other places, going to Aztec calendars and predicting the end of the world. And it just...
Mayan ones.
And the Mayan ones. And yes, actually, it was Mayan, wasn't it? But you get people going to these sources almost at random and saying, well, how do I make meaning out of this? Because I don't know what happened in this period of X hundred years of our history. We need something to have happened there. These people didn't just vanish from the time of Solomon's temple or from whatever other arbitrary time they've picked. So now they have to fill in. There's that impetus. I have to know what happened in that space. Otherwise, it's the Dark Ages.
And I think we are in the Dark Ages, and I don't think we've had some glimpses of light, but human history is pretty dark.
Yeah. It comes back to this business of you have to decorate the floors and the walls and the ceiling. Most of history is just blank walls, blank floor, blank ceiling, and we want to decorate it. So we decorate it with people who now, I guess, are like celebrities.
Yeah, Robin Hood.
And famous kings and famous heroes and famous this. We focus on them because they decorate the otherwise uniform or nearly uniform background noise of human existence.
And I don't believe in archetypes, indwelling archetypes, but I think it is worth looking at how people develop in archetypical ways or in stereotypical ways. And so, a whole part of the Bannon nonsense is a belief in the Indian color system, or caste system as it's
Caste system, yes.
called, but of course the Sanskrit word for it is color.
Yeah, Varna.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the paler you are, this is starting to sound similar, children, the better you are, and the darker you are, the worse you are. And this idea of caste that Kali Yuga, which is believed in by all of these demagogues, it would seem, is the age of the dark-skinned slave people. We have the merchant, the warrior, and the priestly castes, all of them splitting out into 2,000 little fragments of caste, but 4 super castes. And democracy is held to be the rule of the slaves by these people. They are opposed to democracy. They want to see an end to it so that we will cycle back into a lovely time where people like them are completely in charge and people like us do as we're told, and then everything will be perfect.
This is a recurring theme in history as well.
Yeah.
Even democracy itself was the privileged few ruling over those who weren't wise enough to rule.
Yeah, in Athens, the women were slaves. They were kept in pretty much purda, massed. So women had nothing to do with politics. There were actual slaves. They had nothing to do with politics. And the Attic democracy, the original democracy, ordered at least 2 genocides that I'm aware of. And so some kind of, this was a great way to be. No, it doesn't say anything about it. It seems better to me if there is a consensus among human beings, if human beings agree on a way forward, rather than there being discord and dissent among human beings. And the idea that it has to be enforced from above, that this is the historical nightmare that we're trying to get away from. This point where, and our systems have not been successful. We are still very much in the hands of the powerful, and the powerful are not the wise.
You don't have to be wise to be powerful. You
do
have to be ruthless. And there's an awful lot of research that points to the idea that the people who are keenest to be in power are the people that you should least trust, because they're narcissists, or worse, they're toxic. And their desire for power is not out of universal benevolence.
I mean, that takes us to a point, and it's been brought up to me many times over the decades, the idea, that those who want to have power should not be allowed to have power, and that those who do not want to have power, the only people who can be trusted with power. I think that particular catch-22 is not true. I don't think that only destructive, negative people want to have influence in the world. And it comes down to the word, whether we use the word influence or the word power at this point. But I think there have been very positive leaders. There have been people who care about their followers and who seek to achieve something good. And there are leaders who have achieved good. If we look back into the 19th century and we look at the incredible changes in Western society that have occurred since then, we've all got flushing toilets now. Very positive changes. Child labor. We're finally getting around to doing something about the sexual abuse of children in the last decade or so. The Western world seems to be waking up to this problem the last 2 decades. But nonetheless, we have, so I think that we've got reasons to be hopeful and that society has changed so much. But we need to look towards a pro-human, pro-social future, rather than this tribalism that is really kind of if you were born in this part of the world before this time, then, you know, you're okay, you're one of us. And I think the point, we get to points of culture that whenever I look at artistic, aesthetic culture, let's not, you have to be very careful with this word culture because it applies to yogurt as well, or yogurt, as some people call it. But the great advances, it seems to me, happen in human culture where cultures meet, where mongrelization, to use Barack Obama's word, occurs. And you can sit, for example, you sit all over the place, but when French Impressionist painters started to see Japanese ukiyo-e prints, it changed the way they worked. And I mean, it's very visible in the work of Vincent van Gogh, who, of course, is a post-impressionist. He did impressions of posts, which is not hard to do. You just stand still. But he actually used reed pens to get the Japanese effect, his ink line. And those are points of, you know, as an artist, you welcome some new kind of music or some new approach. And it's incorporated, and it's incorporated so rapidly. People take it on, you know, and say, well, it's now ours. It's part of our tradition to wear kimonos or what have you.
Oh, but now you've got cultural appropriation, haven't you?
And plenty of it.
But it's sometimes treated as a bad thing. And sometimes, to be fair, sometimes it's being done in a less than charitable spirit, and maybe it isn't such a good thing.
We might be able to understand how... I'm reading Confucius at the moment, I admit it. I'm reading the Analects. I thought it was time after so many years reading. And about half of it frightens the life out of me because it's about duty. It's about honoring your parents and doing as you're told, honoring authority and doing as you're told. And I see that it's kept Chinese society together for a very long time. But it seems to me that we have to go a stage beyond that. And in every generation, reconsider what the values and the virtues are. What should we be doing? How should we be behaving? Rather than how can I fit in slavishly with some tradition or with something that somebody thought. And so we come inexorably to the Kalama Sutta and the idea that you shouldn't believe things because your mum and dad tell you, because your priest tells you, because a ghost whispers it in your ear, because you like the idea of it. You should check things out and test them and see if they're true. And we're not seeing that. The traditionalists are people, they're pseudo-mystics. They're not people who've had a really profound mystical experience. They're people who've read a book and believed, you know, Olavo is actually a professional astronomer, as well as being the advisor to the chief advisor to President Bolsonaro. And that's a little bit worrying that we've got people who are, you know, determining the future from looking at the entrails of beasts or the way the smoke goes when they burn their liver or what have you. We're still stuck in that rather than seeking to be rational and provide evidence and scientific reasoning. These people they want the end days. You know, they want Jesus to come back as soon as possible. And if that means killing everyone on earth first, they're happy to do it because they're so desperate to meet Jesus, who I don't think he's going to be very happy with them for what they did.
Not at all.
I tried to point that out.
Not at all. Yes, well, that opens up other cans of worms, plural. Plural cans, not plural. Well, plural worms as well. There is one thing I want to throw into the mix here at this point, and that is that we talked a lot about how there has been this creation of official traditions, you know, the official commercial ones, the official political ones, the official tools for steering people's attitudes, opinions, and emotions. But as somebody who grew up in a traditional setting, in my own neighborhood, there are ordinary traditions. And the thing is with these kinds of traditions that, again, they are like the floor and the walls and the ceiling. They're not like whoa, that's amazing, until you get somebody who decides to do it on YouTube or some other Instagram or whatever and say, look at this, it's amazing, isn't it? But apart from that, these other things were just common sense. They were like the common sense mortar that holds the bricks together. So there is a kind of a cyclic necessity to some of these things, where we do these things because that's part of how we hold ourselves together against the chaos of outside, or against the uncertainty of what's coming or what's happening at the time. So it might be something as simple as food, as recipes. And as you know, my wife has been really deeply into the history of food here in England.
Yeah, and has written an exceptional book on the topic, which I recommend to everybody. It's wonderful.
Yeah, well,
Rich slices of history.
Yeah, and I have to confess an interest here. I enjoyed reading it, and I enjoyed eating the food.
It's a cookery book, and it's fascinating. How does that happen? It really is fascinating.
Yeah, but you're talking about these things which were recipes that were handed down over centuries and centuries and centuries, through generations of families, through generations of local societies, through generations of cultures. And those are the traditions that somehow don't get talked about as much. And yet they're there. I mean, my grandmother made certain foods, and I would ask her, well, I'd like to know how you make this. And her answer was always, oh, you don't need to know that. You marry a good Ukrainian girl, she'll make these.
There you go.
And of course I moved to England, married a Scottish woman, and
thankfully she could cook, so you were all right.
Thankfully she can cook, but all these foods my grandmother made, I have to go and buy them someplace now, because I never learned how to make them. But those kinds of traditions, they are the floor and the walls and the ceilings of the house. And after all, that's what we live in. We don't live in the paintings and in the pretty carpets and in the wall hangings. We live in the structure of the house. And I think I would want to be careful that we don't throw out the baby of those genuine traditions, some of which do genuinely go back centuries, because this is how you make sourdough bread. For all I know, my grandmother's sourdough bread was cultured. Well, I know it was cultured from sourdough starters that she brought with her from Ukraine. That much I know. What I don't know is how far back it went into her history, into her past. I have no idea about that. But those are genuine things. They really existed, but nobody much cares.
And I think it's right to live with a respect for our ancestors.
Yeah,
I think that is something we should do more openly in the West. Perhaps have a respect for the past and what's gone before us, because we don't tend to. But people, somebody like Steve Bannon going on about being spiritual rather than material, given that he's a multi-millionaire, is a little bit of a problem. People who want to go back to a tradition, which of course wouldn't have included computers or cyber hacks, which of course is what Dugin's friends are up to. That the point is, as Salvador Dali said, and I'm not tremendously keen on his painting, but occasionally he said very clever things, that man. And he said the only thing you don't have to try to be is modern. You are modern.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how much you believe in tradition, you are not going to bring the past back. You are going to head off into the future. And it's a matter of whether that future will be habitable for our species because of the damage we're causing. And the path that so many of these ideologues, look at Bolsonaro and the destruction of the rainforest. Rampant, and that the rivers of air that move from South America and up over the plains will stop depositing rain.
There
will be a massive drought in the next 20 years as a consequence of deforestation. That seems likely. That seems as if it's about to happen. And instead, we have some guy who's casting Bolsonaro's astronomical chart.
Astrological, please.
Astrological. Yeah, I've gone wrong there, didn't I? I said astronomer earlier. Professional.
You did. I didn't want to interrupt you, but
Yeah,
yes, you did.
Professional astrologer. Forgive me. Rookie mistake. So he's having somebody casting his chart while he is ripping the world apart. We're having people who are saying that Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin were great leaders.
Yeah.
When what they did was bring down horror and terror upon tens of millions of people, from the Ukrainian famine, 33, 34, where perhaps 2 million people died because of Stalin's craziness, absolute craziness. That these people are being viewed, these strong men are being viewed as heroes by the present generation, is simply a lack of information about them. All you have to do is read what Hitler said and look at what happened as a consequence. Look at, the Night of the Long Knives and how he treated his own, or the Night of Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. And these inventions of the enemy, the other, the outsider who is to be destroyed. So the telling of tall tales, all Jews are infested with lice, which will kill Germans. That was a common story that was being told.
And even the cartooning. I mean, you can do so much damage with a cartoon. And the cartoons of Jewish people as vermin and beasts, and
and similarly, as you know, in Opening Our Minds, I have a picture of the American perception of the Japanese during World War II.
Exactly.
And at the same time, of course, Uncle Joe Stalin and Mao were great heroes of the American people. And there are posters. I went through hundreds and hundreds of posters, finding the ones I eventually used. And it's, the first casualty of war is truth. And at this point, you have the proud, tall Chinese soldiers and the little mouse-like Japanese soldiers, that things are reduced to simplicity. And if I thought I was dealing with people who'd had genuine spiritual experience, some transcendent experience that had made them love humanity and want to do good, I might have a different view. But what I see are very shallow, emotionally driven, nervous human beings who are not happy and are fanatical and determined that they can cure their own pain by enforcing these ideas on the world.
And by inflicting pain on others.
Yeah. And the little twist on this is that another aspect of this is the éminence grise, the grey eminences that sit behind other politicians. And of course, in the United States and now spread throughout the world, you have what was originally the International Christian League, more commonly known as the Family. And nearly all significant American politicians, Republican or Democrat, have some affiliation with this group, which again enforces certain ideas. And one of them is it, you'll correct me, Romans 13? And which basically says your leaders are appointed by God, so do as you're told. This is taught to trainee aides who will be working with politicians on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. They are taught that Stalin and Hitler, because they were leaders, were therefore appointed by God, were therefore people worth studying. So they are actually, as Jeff Charlotte's excellent books, The Family and C Street, detail this training of the next generation to, again, adopt a tradition. But that tradition is actually traditions change, and
Yeah.
it's moving towards a more sensible and better way of doing something, rather than finding the secret in the Bible code that tells you what color shoes you should wear or what have you, that will make you gladly happy at all times. So
it has to be said at this point that that particular way of interpreting Romans 13 gets a lot of pushback from people who have actually made a point of studying it in any depth, but it is very useful. It's like so many other things, you pull out a magic text and it becomes like an incantation. Back in the time of slavery in America, there was actually a version of the New Testament which was created to give to slaves, which had all of the bits removed from it, where Jesus talks about loving people, and all these things that would have undermined slavery. They were just taken out, and that was the version of the New Testament that was given to the slaves, so that as far as they were concerned, being a good Christian slave meant doing what you're told, enduring any indignity or cruelty, and looking forward to the sweet by and by.
Yeah.
And that's unconscionable.
And it is where the religion of whiteness actually arises in Western history, that because the superiority, so one commentator has written, the superiority that the Europeans felt over the Africans was not to do with skin color. It was to do with the Christian religion. And when the idea of evangelizing slaves started to grow in the 18th century, as you say, it meant that the differentiation had to happen. So now these people were no longer despised for being pagans. They were despised for being black. And they're being despised by the people who were treating them in an entirely unchristian way.
Yes, exactly. And that mythology still lives on. There are still people like that who propagate that mythology as if it were valid and as if we actually should want to go back to it. This is a man who rejoices in being in Moscow, Idaho. He calls himself a pastor. He writes what has been, I don't know because I haven't read it, but I've read quotations posted on the internet. And I think the judgment is right that he writes what could be called soft to a bit more than soft pornography. He is, well, here's the quotation. Slavery as it existed in the South was not an adversarial relationship with pervasive racial animosity. Because of its dominantly patriarchal character, it was a relationship based on mutual affection and confidence. There has never been a multiracial society which has existed with such mutual intimacy and harmony in the history of the world. The credit for this must go to the predominance of Christianity. The gospel enabled men who were distinct in nearly every way to live and work together, to be friends and often intimates. I guess he's referring to the rapes of slaves by their masters. This happened to such an extent that moderns indoctrinated on civil rights propaganda would be thunderstruck to know the half of it. Slave life was, to the slaves, a life of plenty, of simple pleasures, of food, clothes, and good medical care. In spite of the evils contained in the system, we cannot overlook the benefits of slavery for both blacks and whites. Slavery produced in the South a genuine affection between the races that we believe we can say has never existed in any nation before the war or since. And this man calls himself a pastor. His name is Doug Wilson, and that's from his publication, Southern Slavery as It Was. It's a pamphlet that he published in 1996. And I mean, I don't even know where to start with how wrong-headed that is, how ignorant of history it is, how ignorant it is of what slavery did to African Americans, with a damage that goes on to this day, an inherited damage, if you like, a culturally ensconced damage. I just can't even begin to know how he could sit there with his bare face hanging out, as my mother would have said, and say these things. But he's not alone in this. He's one of I don't know if I want to call it a large minority, but a substantial minority of people who call themselves Christians and are willing to say that slavery may very well have been the best thing that ever happened to Black people in America. Somehow we've stolen it from them by treating them like equals, or trying to treat them like equals, and trying to treat them like free people. We've stolen from them this wonderful patriarchal subservience and humiliation
that we can read about in the contemporary journals.
Yeah.
Donald Trump introduced us to fake news. I'm sure he wasn't the first person to suggest it, but it came up almost every day during his presidency that anything disagreed with him was fake news. But much of what he said, and he has been very seriously fact-checked and found wanting in several thousand occasions. But far more dangerous than fake news is fake history.
Yes.
Which is the last draft of the news, if you should turn it around. News is the first draft of history. And as you say, it beggars belief. You know, when I was writing about Dylan Roof, the Charleston massacre, for Lone Actor Terrorism, working with Steve Hassan and two other people. But it meant that I had to read Dylan Roof's last rendition, his statement to the world, before he went out and committed this. For any fans of Dylan Roof, he has now publicly disowned his act and said that he was insane at the time.
Wow.
So whether he's doing that to shorten his prison sentence or get into a nicer place than he's in, I don't know. Whether it's truthful or not, I don't know. But he has renounced it. So, but in the last tradition, he puts forward the view that he claims to have read hundreds, and that is the number, of testimonies by former slaves about how idyllic their lives were. And as a little bit of a historian in my time, I have had to check primary sources quite frequently, because if you can, you should. So you go and look at the actual stuff of the time. And for anybody, I think it was Thomas Thistlewood who wrote a journal of his time as a slave keeper, an Englishman in the West Indies, I believe. And I think it stands as a guide to anybody who wants to romanticize this tremendous evil. And we know so much about it that it's not even, it's like Holocaust denial, you know. What are we going to do if people will not see what is obvious? But it pushes us to this very important tendency among the humankind, myself included, which is to believe what we would like to believe.
Sure.
To then elevate what we would like to believe to the level of certainty. So as you've heard me say it often enough, the born again who sought to convert me, who backed away from me and said, I don't understand the Bible, but I know it's all true. Well, no. Keep reading.
Keep reading, get some understanding. Learn some languages. Do some translating.
A little bit of Greek here, a little bit of Hebrew there, a little bit of Aramaic if you need. And come to understand that you're dealing with something which is not a simple rule book that's ordering you to misbehave in a certain way. But what you're dealing with is your own conscience. And that's what you should be dealing with in terms of looking at the world and, you know, what stories to impose upon it and the extent to which we are believing things because we wish to believe them, not because they're true. For example, the idea that the alt-right uses the Confederate flag. It doesn't use the Confederate flag. It uses the Confederate battle flag. Right. Let's be very exact about this. But when we check into the details and the truth, and that one's a fairly irrelevant one, but when we check into the truth and the details of events, they don't play out quite as simply as either the neoliberals or the neoconservatives or the neo-Nazis would like us to believe, that history is Mississippi of lies. There's Voltaire yet again. But we can, there's this kind of postmodern view now that everybody's truth is true and everything that everybody believes is equally true, and therefore history is made up. And we do have such a thing as scientific history. It is possible to examine the real documents.
Yeah.
So, you know, a simple example, I went on and on about this when I was on a little bit culty, and I think they'll probably cut it all out if they've got any sense. But for me, a startling piece of history was finding out about King John, the man who was, according to the cartoons and the Errol Flynn movie, the king at the time of Robin Hood, who is a fictional character, who seems to be based upon somebody who actually lived in a different time period, a little bit later, but we won't get into that. When I read The History of King John by W.L. Warren, as a very young man, more than 40 years ago, I was astonished because what they'd done in the late 40s and early 50s, they started to open the court records. So they're going back to, you know, he was king from 1198 to 1216. And here they are, more than 700 years later, finally actually looking at the daily record of his court, so-called pipe rolls, to which these things are bound, and seeing what he actually did with his day. And this had never interested any historian until the 1950s. And what they discovered was that the accounts that were written about him by two Canterbury monks, who were his sworn enemies because he had refused to let Canterbury appoint its own archbishop, because the tradition had always been that the king had appointed the archbishop. That got him into trouble with Rome. He was excommunicated. The whole country was put under extradition. So he had enemies there, and they're the people who wrote his biography, Roger Wendover and Matthew Paris, and invented all sorts of stuff, which was retold by historians right into the 1950s. Seeing that history, you can delve even that far back, find primary documents and look at something that's useful. Well, the same with Bannon, Dugin, Olavo, that in looking at what they're saying, their sources are really pathetically poor. Julia Sivola and René Guénon. The idea of a perennial philosophy, an religion that is behind all religions. Finally, there was the sonologist Angus Graham, who I was reading him, as you know, a wonderful, brilliant commentator, particularly on Taoism. But he pointed out that it's all very well and good looking for the similarities between religions, and that's very nice. But you've got to also see that there are serious disagreements on basic principles. There is no religion. We're not going back to a better version of the truth that has been diluted. When we go back to that religion, and we know what the religion was because we have the Babylonian texts, so it takes us pretty close to what the Sumerians before them believed. We know what they believed. We have the ring seals. We have all sorts of material. Now that we know that we've been told a lot of stories about history, and many of them are stories that when they become ways of hating other people, when they become ways of destroying other people, we should all be very, very concerned about.
Yeah. And this is something, this persistent idea that we can somehow peel away something, some enemy has done this, you know, and we will get to this higher truth that encompassed the world.
Mm.
And Madame Blavatsky did it, and the entire Theosophical movement did it. Anthroposophy's gone in that direction. Most of the New Age movement at one point or another, with the exception of the self-help psychotherapy, pseudo-psychotherapy groups and some of that kind of thing, but with the exception of those, so much of the New Age movement, so-called, went in that direction, that they were trying to excavate to the truth behind all religions.
Just as the Nazis under Himmler, the Ahnenerbe, with 50 divisions, a ministry with 50 divisions, was researching the history of the Aryan people.
Yeah.
And they gave us really absolutely and completely nothing, unless we wander off into the morning of the magicians, or the spear of Leviathan, these bizarre concoctions. They didn't find anything out. They didn't find the Ark of the Covenant. They didn't, Indiana Jones is not actually true.
What?
Yes.
Are you kidding?
Temple of Doom might be, but
I was going to write a whole series of books about the deep history in Indiana Jones, and you just spoiled it all.
Yeah, sorry about that. So I suppose sooner or later we have to come to a conclusion. And so is there anything you'd like to say in summing up?
I have been impressed over the years with the way that, and this is something that we probably should talk about in more depth at some other time, but with the way that we like to think that we are thinking apes that feel, when in fact we are feeling apes that think. And the way our feelings are crystallized for us and are preserved for us is in story.
Yeah.
And this has all sorts of implications for how people are recruited, how people are held, how people are made to stay where they don't want to be, and what happens to them, how they're harmed when they finally decide to leave by the persistence of the stories that held them bound. And tradition is playing, it's either preserving a story that has some root in truth, or it's playing with story in a way that makes a meal out of a morsel. And so you get this idea of, well, we have this long tradition of the pure Aryan race, or this long tradition of the pure Slav, or the pure this, or the pure that. And Putin wants to bang on about how Ukrainians are pure Slavs and belong to Russia. What about the Danes and the other Scandinavians that populated early Ukraine when Moscow was a backwater?
Yeah, all the way to Kiev.
All the way to Kiev. And the fact is that you can go back a couple of centuries before Moscow ever mattered historically, and you find Kiev was an important trading place, an important nexus for trade and communication and other things between nations. And the intermarrying that took place, and Johannes was the one that said to me when we first met back in 1982 or something. We were just talking. He wanted to know, naturally, because he always asked questions about everything. He wanted to know where my name was from. So I said to him, I said, "Oh, so you're probably part Danish." And it had never occurred to me to make that connection. Sitting there in Denmark, never occurred to me to make that connection until he said that. Oh my gosh, that's different. But Putin seems to not know that part of history. His knowledge of history seems to stop before you get back far enough to see that happened.
Traditionalists don't seem to have any interest in tradition.
No.
They don't want to understand that, in fact, peoples have come down from the steppe of Russia century after century.
Yeah.
The Vandals, the Alans, the Swaves all went through the Roman Empire, and populated North Africa. So, even if we were just looking at how many people can put their ancestry back to Genghis Khan in the 13th century. That the problem is when you look at, you know, how many ancestors you have, then it runs, you know, that same binary 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128.
Absolutely.
You don't have to go many generations. And it's why the racial purity laws in Germany in Nazi Germany, were very restricted, because they'd realized that if you went back beyond a certain point, you would definitely have somebody Jewish. You would definitely have a Spanish grandmother, as it used to be said in this country.
Or a Romany.
Yeah. And indeed, Adam Henderson, the geneticist, has put forward the view that everybody alive has Australian Aborigine genes.
Yeah.
You can't. The fact that we found Neanderthal genes should be a bit worrying to people who are claiming to be pure Aryans, because from the ones I've met, they've probably got rather more Neanderthal genes than the rest of us, without putting too fine a point on it. So ethnicities are generated and created within certain generations. A group of people decide they're going to have this little forelock and a little hat somewhere in the, about 1700, and today they're traditionalists because they're doing something that was done then, but they're not doing something that was done in Solomon's time. When Ed Hussein, who wrote The Islamist, which is a very insightful book, he joined an Islamist sect, Omar Bakri's sect in London, and went out to Syria. And he found that the way that they dressed in the Muslim sect in London was the way that Christians dressed in Syria. Muslims didn't.
Yeah.
And so they plugged themselves into a tradition with the little hats and all of that.
Yeah.
It's Disney World. It's fake. There's no need for it to be authentic. We need to accept what Salvador Dali said and accept that we are modern. We are contemporary people. We are an expression of traditions, but
you remind me of something that I'd forgotten earlier. This problem of trying to be traditional presupposes that there's a cutoff point. You know, like we talk about, oh, this is an antique because it's X years old. If it were 1 year younger, it wouldn't be an antique yet. There is no such cutoff point with tradition.
Vintage. Yeah.
You know, in a sense, you and I have established the tradition of talking to each other. It's a tradition.
It goes back thousands of years.
It goes, well, it may feel like that, but I think we have to be careful enough to say that there is no cutoff point to say, well, it's a tradition. Traveling over here and living in a completely different culture, there are traditions that were family traditions, which probably do go back before my grandparents went to America. I'm pretty sure of that, but I don't have the knowledge, the wherewithal, or frankly, the group of people to make those happen. And a tradition isn't something that one lone person can do very easily by themselves. And a real tradition requires an understanding of why you're doing that thing. What is the point of making those 12 foods on Christmas Eve? You know, I still miss them. There are foods there that I still, come on, let me, just one Christmas, one Christmas Eve, I want to have all 12 of them.
If any Ukrainians are watching this, Christian would be...
But without the group of people for whom those are meaningful, one of the things I discovered is that a tradition that only lives in my head is better off only in my head, because as soon as I bring it out into the open, somehow it dies, because tradition is meant to be shared. The very word means that which is handed down. And so the idea that you have a tradition that you can't give to anybody is it's the death of tradition. It's just a thing you do personally. And I think that's an important thing to say, that there isn't a cutoff point. There's an agreement. A tradition is essentially, it's an agreement. It's a social contract, if you like, we agree that this is important to us. It's important to have a maypole in the town square. It's important to have our dancers out there ringing their, with their little frilly bells around their ankles and their sticks, and that means something to us.
Important to call Christmas the holiday season.
Absolutely. Our
Been doing it for 20 years now.
Our dancer is actually the head of our dance troupe here, is the mayor of one of our main streets. So we actually have two mayors here. We have the political mayor and we have the mayor of Ox Street. And, that's our Morris dancers. They do a little thing. They elect a mayor. They troop down to a particular pub and they toast the new mayor and so on. And it's all very beautiful. It's lovely to watch. It doesn't mean a thing to me because I didn't grow up with it, but it's fun to watch. It makes me almost feel like a tourist here, even though I've lived here 30 years. So that seems important to say, that it isn't how long the tradition is, it's how much agreement there is. This is how we want to identify ourselves, to say this means something to us. And if you don't have that agreement, you have a wish for a tradition, but not necessarily an actual tradition anymore. No, I think I'll stop there.
Well, I'll just add one story. My father-in-law to be, Jim, he was an English teacher who became a teacher of English teachers.
Wow.
And one of the anecdotes he tells, and he is a store of anecdotes, and as he will say, I've probably told you this, and sometimes he has. But one of the stories he tells is, as an English teacher with children in the classroom, he'd marked up a map of the world and he'd taken words in English and shown where they came from. And he said that the pupils were very disappointed. We thought this was English we were speaking. And so, the idea that the word bungalow comes from Bengal.
Yes.
Or ketchup, I think, is a Malaysian word. And of course, English, you can dismember it completely into its origins. There are very few English words left. One of them is groundsel, which is a weed with little yellow flowers on it. That is an actual Saxon word. It's one of the few that we still have. And if you expand it out, it means ground swallower. Because if you let it seed, it's a weed. It's a weed. So it's the ground swallower or the groundsel. But most of, you can take the French approach. They have the Académie Française, and that determines whether a word is allowed into the French language or not.
Right.
Which is why they've got unique terms for everything to do with the computer, because they had to invent new words. Because you can't have. Now, they're still fighting to get rid of le weekend.
The weekend, yeah.
That's it's still there. But this idea that our culture is now, that the past, we are incorporating new things all the time and changing all the time. There was a journalist who came back from being a US correspondent for some years. And he said that the strangest thing was coming back to England and the language had changed. Whereas in America, the language had changed, had not changed. They still use words like cool, which of course comes from the 1920s.
We also use gotten. You
still got gotten and begotten and things like that hark back to an earlier English. But what he was saying was that idiomatic British English changes more rapidly than American. The point was the change itself, that, to the extent that we wouldn't recognize Shakespeare's accent, let alone, he probably spoke like this, probably from somewhere around Birmingham, to be or not to be, that's the question, mate. That so much has changed, so much is different. What's our tradition? We don't wear the clothes that our grandparents wore. We certainly don't wear the same clothes that Shakespeare wore, They definitely need washing by all of this ripped velvet and all of this sort of stuff. These traditions are actually created newly with every generation, and to base a political system on the ridiculous notion that we are in the end days and have to kill everybody as fast as possible is not healthy. It's not good for us.
Nor is the idea that our traditions have to somehow be dragged out of a past that didn't exist in order to hold on to them. You've reminded me of something else there, and that is what happens to traditions with expatriate communities. I know I've told you before that there are whole areas of New Jersey where you can still attend the Highland Games, the Scottish Highland Games. And the whole thing, it looks like it's out of a 1920s newsreel of Scotland, except that these are 20th century and now 21st century New Jerseyans whose ancestry takes them back. And we have places with names like Scotch Plains, and the town next to mine had a section of it called Dundee, and that's where the Scots people lived. And it crossed over the river into Wallington, where more Scots people lived. First Scotsman I ever met as a child, lived in Wallington, just across the river from Dundee. And I couldn't understand he was the father of one of my friends. I couldn't understand a word he said. I found out much later, when I finally came to this country, that he was from a place called the Gorbals in Scotland, in Glasgow. And his accent was incomprehensible to me. It sounded like somebody had grabbed him by the throat and shook him when he tried to talk. So it came out as a series of glottal. It came out as a series of glottal stops, as far as I could hear with my 12-year-old ears. As a child, I never heard anything like this in my life. And what I heard was, I'm Peter, what did your dad just say? But also there was a program on the BBC, must be a good 20 years old now, where they looked at the movement of British accents to pre-revolutionary America, to colonial America.
Tennessee is where the most authentic English is.
They found there are parts of the Appalachians where people are still speaking 17th century English. And when I traveled in parts of the Appalachians, I met people that I hadn't been here yet, so I didn't know at that time why their accent was, you don't sound like anybody else from around here. But just by going into those very rarefied communities, I was hearing people speaking what I came to recognize when I came here. I came to recognize as a much older form of British English. And they've preserved it. They've preserved words. They preserved phrases and ways of speaking that got cut off from the mainland, from the homeland, if you like, during the revolution. And they just stayed to themselves. They kept to themselves, and they carried on talking in this very authentic but very old form of British English.
It's not generally known that when St. Patrick, or Padraig, if you prefer the Irish version, when he drove all the snakes out of Ireland, they celebrated by making green beer and stamping a shamrock on the top of it. And it's a tradition that goes all the way back to St. Patrick. I remember being really shocked when I realized that on St. Patrick's Day in America, people drink green beer with the shamrock embossed in it. That was, wow, that's a tradition that has arisen over there. Still, we better come to the end of our musings.
To the end of tradition.
The end of tradition, and we will be thoroughly modern. But, then you get contradictions like the new Kadampa tradition, which we've talked about elsewhere.
That's another story altogether, yes.
In jazz, we've had neo-traditionalism.
Yes.
It's just too confusing for me. I can't grasp the vast concept.
I've got books of poetry that are called modern poetry. They're coming up to 100 years old.
Yeah.
What is that about?
All the movements in art that have called themselves Art Nouveau, for example, or the Jugendstil, the young style. But it goes back, if you look at medieval music, they decided they were going to call their stuff the Ars Nova, the new art. And so you then have the Ars Antiqua, which is sort of 14th century backwards. But the new stuff is like, you know, the Agincourt Carol from 1415, what have you.
Hot off the press.
Hot off the press. It's all very confusing. And thank you for helping me to...
Well, thank you for provoking my brain cells to speak to each other.
It's good to do that occasionally. Thank you very much.
Well,
for listening.
It's a tradition. It's a tradition with British Telecom to say, it's good to talk. I'll leave the accent to you.
Good to talk.
That's the one.
Yeah, that's the one. Right. Thank you so much. And we'll all look for our BT adverts online.
Yes. And, on the internet. They'll be there. Preserved as traditions.
You can't get rid of it, can you? I'm watching old Dick Cavett shows, actually, but we won't get into that.
Oh, he was great fun.
There was some really fine moments there. So thank you very much for spending time with us.
And thank you.
Spend more time with us if and when you can. And we'll see you later. I'm John Atack, my dear friend Christian Szurko.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.
I'm not actually saying any of this.
No, and I'm not even sitting here.
Yeah, we don't really exist.